Daniel J. Flynn's book is titled The Man Who Invented Conservatism, The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer. Mr. Flynn points out in his introduction that Meyer travels from communist to conservative, peace activist to soldier, Jew to Catholic, rhapsodist of Satan to cheerleader of Reagan, and free love enthusiast to family man. Flynn, who is a senior editor of the American Spectator and a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, tells readers how he found the forgotten papers of Frank Meyer. It's in a warehouse in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Meyer lived between 1909 and 1972. He was 62 when he died. Dan Flynn, what's your background?
I'm a senior editor at the American Spectator. I'm a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, and I'm an author of 7 books. I'm from Massachusetts and spent time in Vermont as well.
Where'd you grow up in Massachusetts?
I grew up in Arlington, Massachusetts, so right outside of Boston. I was a Fenway Park vendor, so I got the full Boston experience.
And how did you start into things of the mind?
I've always been a reader, and I think for a lot of readers, there's ultimately a moment where they want to make a jailbreak from so the pews to the pulpit. They want to cease being you never cease being a reader, but you want to maybe do what these people are doing that you read and become a writer yourself. And I think that's what happened with me.
What was the first time you wrote something?
Oh boy. Well, there was certainly in college for student publications and things like that. And I think the thing that you find when you write something for an audience, you can turn something into a professor when you have an audience of one, and you can turn in junk, but you'll embarrass yourself if you turn in something to an audience of your peers or if to, hundreds or thousands of people are reading it. And I think very quickly that forces you to become a better writer, but just the sheer embarrassment of putting out junk.
What's your favorite book?
Oh boy. I would say my favorite author is P.G. Wodehouse. I like to laugh. And so I think when this book tour is over, I have a whole bookshelf of P.G. Wodehouse. And I don't know that I have a favorite P.G. Wodehouse book, but probably the P. Smith series is my favorite P.G. Wodehouse. And I think for nonfiction, I spent 2 years of my life reading Will and Ariel Durant's Story of Civilization, and that was a huge influence on me, I think subconsciously on my writing. I always loved Eric Hoffer's The True Believer as just sort of a slim book, so those are some of my favorites.
I have the Durant books right behind me. You can't see them. I have not read them. And you know the story. For years, the Book of the Month Club would give them away if you'd sign up. What was it like reading all that, and what did you learn from it? I know it's that could go on for days.
Well, I have a picture of myself that I love. It's not like I usually don't love pictures of myself, but it's me sitting next to a light armored vehicle when I was in the Marine Corps, reading one of the Will and Ariel Durant Story of Civilization books. I think it might have been the Reformation or something like that. So I took the books with me. In the Marine Corps, you have a lot of downtime. So I read them in the Marine Corps. Sometimes I read them at the gym. People thought it was weird, like in between sets. So over 2 years to read those books, they're big books. So it's a big project. And strangely enough, when I had been out of touch with my father, and I said, well, he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm reading these books. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm reading those books too. Where are you at? And it was just a coincidence. I guess you are your father's son, right? So we were reading those books at the same time. We just didn't know it.
Thousands of pages, 11 different volumes. What would you say if you had to write a 250-word essay was the takeaway from all that learning?
Oh, boy. Well, I mean, it's the easy one would be like History Repeats or something like that. I think the Durants were, Will Durant was a philosopher. I mean, he was under, I think, Dewey at Columbia. And I think his interest was always in ideas. He wrote this history, but it was more a history of ideas and how ideas influence action. And I think that's probably the takeaway is how, there used to be a book called Ideas Have Consequences. We're going to talk about Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer was tremendously influenced by Ideas Have Consequences. But that's a short phrase, I think, in a nutshell, is what the Durant series is about. That what happened, these ideas when they were unleashed, what what did they unleash in actions about from statesmen and leaders and that kind of thing? That would be the takeaway.
In the American Spectator that you write for, what is your responsibility?
I'm just a writer. I'm called a senior editor, but it's very rare that I edit anyone. I just write. And over the years, people have offered me editing positions where I would be the editor in chief of this publication or that publication. And I say, no, well, I don't want to do that. And they say, well, you're just a writer. What do you mean I'm just a writer? That's my ambition is to write. The writer is above the editor. The writer is the big guy. Why would I want all these bureaucratic responsibilities? And so I have the title senior editor. I don't know that I've earned it. I'm just sort of a writer.
As you know, most people don't know who Frank Meyer is. You've written this book about him. You've been on a book tour. What have you learned about the public and Frank Meyer since you've been on the book tour?
Well, what you just said is correct. I mean, when Frank was interviewed by Mike Wallace in 1961, Wallace said, I would venture to guess maybe 1 in 1,000 of my viewers know who you are, but I'm told that Barry Goldwater hangs on your political advice and Bill Buckley solicits you for editorial advice. Tell me who Frank Meyer is. And so I think the situation in the last 65 years or so has, Frank has become even a more obscure figure. I happen to enjoy that because I mean, there's so many people that would want to write a book about Lincoln or Churchill or World War II. I think we know a lot about those subjects. I wanted to write about the most interesting story of the 20th century that has not been told. And from from my research, I think Frank is certainly in the running in that category. He led there's a lot of these ideologues that lead kind of black and white lives, and some of them, Whittaker Chambers, Wilmer Kendall, they lead more technicolor lives. Frank lived in 3D. He pops off the page, and for a biographer, you have a guy like that that's leading a very interesting life. It's so much easier. I joked about it the other day that this book has the 5 S's. And if you have 2 of the 5 S's, you're doing well as an author. It has sex, secret agents, suicide, Stalin, and even a little bit of Satanism. And so all these things I think are tremendously interesting, particularly because they are about a guy who's called the man who invented conservatism. You don't think of those things when you think of conservatism.
For my taste, one of the most interesting things you did was that first chapter. And you've got to tell the story of how you found Frank Meyer and the books and the background and the letters.
So I think a good plan was to read books and to read old issues of National Review where Frank was an editor for years, and then I could know what to research and know what questions to ask in interviews. I did that, and when it came time to do research, all the archives closed because of COVID. And I said, oh, I'm in a bad way. What am I going to do? When I looked at Frank's papers at Stanford, the index of it, there was something off. The rhythm was off. And what I mean by that is, as a researcher, if you've done archival work enough, there's usually a certain rhythm to collections. In other words, what would you keep over the course of a lifetime? And particularly a person in the mid 20th century, you probably keep your letters, probably keep your tax returns. There's all sorts of things you would keep. And then, if you're a normal person, you throw a lot of things away. None of that stuff was in what purported to be his papers. So I had a sense they were out there. And I started calling people, and I got some material that was still valuable from private collections. And this went on for about 2 years. And it was almost, I was trying to wish into existence these papers. I mean, they shouldn't have been in existence, but, luck would have it, they were. Frank's oldest son, about a year and a half after I started talking to him, said, well, there was this couple. They bought the house and all of the contents in it, but they've donated to Stanford. And I said, well, why did you tell me about these people first? So I called this couple, and they said, well, we donated the papers to Stanford. And I said, oh, you kept some. And they said, oh, no, we gave it to them. I said, no, I don't think you're lying to me. I don't think you did this on purpose, but you kept some of the papers. You have some of the papers. They're not all there. And we started sort of cross-referencing things. I said, no, those documents aren't out there. And he claimed he had donated them. So a few months into that conversation, the fellow says, well, we have a warehouse. It's like, you have a warehouse? Why don't you tell me this? Take me to your warehouse. So in August of 2022, I went to Altoona, Pennsylvania, and they claimed, well, there's 1,000 boxes. You can't go through them all. Well, there was 663 boxes. It took me 3 days. I went through all of them, and I found 15 large moving boxes of Frank Meyer's papers. These included, letters from Joan Didion, J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, J. Edgar Hoover, Richard Nixon, and then a much larger collection of letters between the principal movers and shakers of the early conservative movement, people like William F. Buckley, Barry Goldwater, Wilmer Kendall, L. Brent Bazell. And so of all of the things that I've done in my life as a writer, there's nothing that even compares to this. I mean, the idea that you're going to find someone's papers in a warehouse that was sort of an Indiana Jones, and it took me 19 months. I went through all of the documents, and what I found was a lot of it, I think, quite valuable, and it allowed me to tell Frank's story.
Where do you live most of the time?
I live in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I try to do some writing. I have a cabin in Vermont, and we're using the internet now, but it helps sometimes to write if you don't have the internet, if you don't have television, if you don't have all these distractions. And the distractions up there are like, am I going to jump in the river or am I going to cut wood? And you can only do that so many times a day. So you're kind of forced and compelled to read and write.
I copied this down that you write in your book. Frank spent 15 years after his father's death railing against the very capitalism that put a roof over his head. And that seems to me to be the theme of your whole book. He goes from communism, as you explain, to capitalism, to conservatism.
A hard word to say.
I don't know why, conservatism.
Conservatism.
Anyway, start with the beginning of Frank Meyer.
Well, Frank was born in Newark, New Jersey in 1909. His mother was heavily involved in the temple and in Jewish charitable causes. She came from wealth. His father made wealth. He created, he had a factory that made raincoats, and he made a very good living off that. And in fact, that company still exists to this day. Frank, at 14, the first evidence I have of him writing is he writes this essay for his temple newsletter and says, all these people that think that, Reform Judaism is losing its grip on people, come to the temple on the holy days. You'll see us overflowing with people. And so he's really enthusiastic about religion at this point. 2 years later, I got an award-winning essay that he wrote at Newark Academy, where he went to school, where he's defending Bolsheviks and atheists. And so something had changed in him from the time of 14 to 16. When he goes over to England, he is very much a socialist. In 1931, he found something called the October Club at Oxford. When he went to Oxford, there were 0 members of the Communist Party in the Oxford student body. When he left, there were over 300 members of this October Club. And in that time, he was in England from 1928 to 1934. He caused a huge ruckus, so much so that they're debating about him on the floor of Parliament. He's in the newspapers. The part of it was Frank had such a magnetic personality. He was able to bring all these people in. But the other part of it is the Great Depression was happening. And so people were considering alternatives to the existing system. And Frank was there to sell communism, and he did a fantastic job of doing that. Now, I mean, one of the interesting things during this time, I mean, he's calling for the violent overthrow of the government of Ramsay MacDonald, who's the prime minister. What I found in these letters is at the same time, he is dating Sheila MacDonald, his youngest daughter. So take whatever romantic figure in the history of communism that you can think of, Che Guevara, John Reed, never did anything as off the wall as them. We have a letter from Sheila MacDonald where she says to Frank, listen, the coast is clear. My father is not around. Come over to 10 Downing Street. We'll have dinner here tonight. And the idea is he's the leading young communist in the country. The MI5 and MI6 papers say he's the founder of the communist student movement in Great Britain. This American was. And he's dating the prime minister's daughter. Well, if you pull off a stunt like that, you're not going to be long for Great Britain. And so for a number of reasons, there were deportation hearings for Meyer, and he becomes a cause celeb. You have people like E.M. Forster, who wrote Passage to India, or Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, signing petitions saying, keep Frank Meyer in the country. Clement Attlee gives a speech on the floor of Parliament defending Meyer. And then other people in Parliament say, no, we should kick this guy out. Michael Street, who was the publisher of the New Republic later turned out that he was a communist spy. Street wrote in his memoirs that Meyer He remembers marching around London with other students chanting "Free Frank Meyer, Free Frank Meyer." So he became a huge deal. They kick him out of the country in 1934. We don't hear about any of this because in 1949 he testifies against his former comrades in the United States. And in these intelligence files of Frank, they had put on a wiretap on the English communists. And here they're saying, "Did you hear about Frank? Yeah, he turned on us. Well, what are we going to do? Well, let's rewrite the history. We need to rewrite the history of the student movement." So they erased Frank Meyer from the history of communism the same way those famous pictures of Stalin with those commissars that would be erased every time they would fall out of favor with the party. They erased Frank Meyer in much the same way. And so, I mean, to me, that's what's exciting about this book is there's all this hidden history that's able to come out, and not just hidden by neglect, like in the White House, but hidden through willful means of censorship, people trying to rewrite their history and rewrite this guy out of their history because he had second thoughts.
You say that he went after the Newark Academy to 6 schools, but only got 1 degree. Would you explain how many, the names of all those schools and what happened to him?
Well, he did a postgraduate year at the Newark Academy, and the reason he did that is because when he applied to Princeton, and he didn't know this at the time, but he faced a lot of anti-Semitism, and so the the headmaster of the Newark Academy was his booster and said, this is even though he has unmistakably Hebrew features. He'd be a good addition to your student body. And the admissions director at Princeton says, "Well, I don't think so. There's plenty of," and he says this, "there's plenty of fine, clean-cut Christian Americans that will be applying this year. And if we give the spot to Meyer, he will be taking one of their spots, people that would fit in better with the college life. He doesn't even strike me as a Hebrew of the better type." And he rebuffs Meyer, and he doesn't let him in. Now I know this because if you go to a fancy school, they keep a file on you, and they have these letters in Meyer's file at Princeton. Now Meyer was persistent. He reapplied. He got in the next year. He dropped out of Princeton, and he had sort of a breakdown there. And the normal thing you would do if you drop into Princeton, people would say, "Why don't you go to the University of Wisconsin or go to this school?" You would go to a school that maybe is not on that level. Um, he said, "No, I want to go to Cambridge or Oxford." It was a very Frank Meyer thing to do. He went to Oxford. He got a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. He worked under a guy named Sliger Urquhart that, depending upon who you talk to, if you've ever read the book Brideshead Revisited, Urquhart is a character, Mr. Sam Gross, not a very flattering character in that book. And he later goes to, after he gets his degree from Oxford, he goes to London School of Economics. And at that point, he's really just an agitator. He's a communist agitator. So ostensibly, he's a grad student. But when they realize he's just there to cause trouble, they kick him out. And by the way, at LSC, he becomes a student body president. How does he do that? Well, they fix the election. He has a guy named Christian Menon, who later became the #2 guy in India under Nehru. And he was in cahoots with Meyer, and they fixed the election, so he would be the student president. So he's pulling off all this crazy stuff in India, in England. In the United States, he goes to the University of Chicago, where again, I looked at his record. He took 36 classes at the University of Chicago. He only got grades in 6 of them. And so most of the time, he was just an activist. And then they got sick of him. Robert Maynard Hutchins, one of the great educational reformers of the 20th century, he was the president of the University of Chicago at that point. Meyer was such a character on campus that when he gave a speech and he looks, who's the first guy to question him? It's Meyer. Everyone hears him saying, an audible gasp, "Oh, God." He had this reputation. He gets kicked out of the University of Chicago. And even though he's getting kicked out of all these schools, and he also did some work at the University of Birmingham, even though he went to all these schools, the Communist Party makes him the director of the Chicago Workers' School. And so he went from college dropout or grad school dropout to essentially the principal of this school in Chicago.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. Where did he meet his wife?
He met her at the Chicago Workers' School. He is the director of the school. She had been warned, "This man is a wolf. Stay away from him." She thought, well, maybe I don't want him to stay away from me. And so, probably like a lot of women, a lot of guys, whenever they have any fantasy about the person at the head of the class, they're looking at them the whole time, and thoughts wander. and she marries Frank in 1940. They're both in the party, and they're very committed to the party, but cracks begin to happen in their communist beliefs.
How? Why?
When Frank was in England, he got this guy named John Cornford, who was a teenager. He recruited him into the party. Cornford was Charles Darwin's great grandson. And there was no reason for him to join the party other than Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer got him in. The day after that guy's, and he became Frank's successor in England. And the day after his 21st birthday, he was killed in Spain fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Meyer carried a great deal of guilt. And so it came time for Meyer to fight in the Second World War. He wanted to sign up and fight Hitler. He wanted to go and fight the Nazis. And the communists, of course, were exhorting people, go fight, go fight the Nazis. And they said, no, Frank. And he said, what do you mean, no? We're telling everyone else to go fight, and you won't let me fight. And they said, well, that's for other people. That's not for you. So then Frank started thinking, well, this, we're saying one thing publicly, we're doing another thing privately. They finally let him go. And when he gets into the squad bay, he realizes that these assembly line workers and electricians, people that he'd only known about through Marx and not through life experience, they were not the proletariat that Marx had made them out to be. They were just sort of regular people. They were not ready to sort of overthrow the government, and they weren't revolutionaries or anything like that. So Frank thought, wow, this is weird. This is a real life thing that clashes with my ideology. He gets hurt in the Marine. I'm sorry, he gets hurt in the Army. He has to recuperate and get surgeries for like a year and a half. And separation from the Communist Party is not a good thing for communists because it's almost like a cult, and they start to rethink things. And Frank, he's almost ready to leave the party. He writes a letter to Earl Browder, who was the general secretary of the party, later the president of the Communist Political Association. And he said, listen, if we're going to attract normal people, doing a good job of these hardcore Marxists, normal people, we need to tether Marxists. We need to fuse Marxism with the American tradition. And we need to do this not just on the 4th of July. We need to do this every day. Now, what's interesting there is that this had a huge effect on the history of both communism and conservatism. Meyer, what he's famous for, he's almost not even a person. He's become like sort of a personification of an idea, fusionism. Well, that idea, what I found was that idea came to him as a communist. This idea that was the sort of the governing force of the American conservatives from, let's say, Barry Goldwater through Ronald Reagan was an idea that came to Frank Meyer as a communist. And what happened was Browner went in that direction, and Frank had taught at the Chicago Worker School. Now all of a sudden he's teaching at the Jefferson School in New York. So there's a Marxist school, now it's an all-American school. They used to start their meetings with the International. Now they started their meetings with the Star Spangled Banner. Browner, he had been the general secretary. Now he's the president of the outfit. So they go in this Americanized direction. And of course, the Soviet Union and the United States are allies at this point. They're both in a united front to fight Hitler. And when the communists realized that after the war, this alliance is not going to last, there comes something to the United States called the Duclos letter. A French communist named Jacques Duclos wrote this letter, basically scolding American communists, saying, "Why did you have playing so nice with Franklin Roosevelt? Why do you have class collaboration instead of class conflict? You need to get your act together," essentially letting them know a Cold War is coming. And Frank and Earl Browder thought that this Americanized party, this independence that they had, this was going to last. And they just didn't realize that this was a French communist talking to them. This was Stalin talking to them through a French communist. And so Browder gets kicked out of the party, who's the leader of the party. Meyer kind of stays around. And in this last moments of this freedom that the communists felt before they went full Cold War, Frank writes a book review for The New Masses, which is a communist-controlled publication. Probably the only time in the history of that publication that a free market kind of book got a really respectful hearing. This was a book by F.A. Hayek, Friedrich Hayek, called The Road to Serfdom. And Frank read it. And when you read his review, it's ostensibly it's a review of The Road to Serfdom. But really what it is in real time, a man's ideology, his life commitments of 14 years, unraveling before your eyes. You can see Frank Meyer's, the gears in his brain shifting, and he's thinking, gee, this Hayek guy has a point. And so for those number of reasons, Frank gets kicked out. Frank leaves the party. Before he leaves, the party realizes that, gee, he's not salvageable. They go to Elsie Meyer's wife and say, listen, we still think you're a good communist, but this guy, your husband, he's not. We want you to divorce him, and you can stay in the party, but he's going to go. And Elsie Meyer loved Frank, and Frank loved Elsie, and they thought, let's get out of here. And they got out.
What happened to Elsie's views of communism?
Say again?
What happened to Elsie's views of communism?
I think they changed with Frank. I mean, one of the letters that I had with her father was a shoe manufacturer in St. Louis. And during the Second World War, there were all of these edicts from the government saying, you know, you'll get arrested if you sell black shoes on this day. You'll get arrested if you sell brown shoes on this day. So certain kind of colors you could sell. You'd only buy a couple of pairs of shoes a year, which I think for most people is probably fine. But she thought, well, gee, this is a little bit heavy-handed. But the whole ideology that it was a government sort of directed market that she was for, and she realized, well, this isn't really working out, these wartime measures. So she went along with Frank. Their relationship was so close that if you could almost view them singularly. I mean, if one was going to go in one direction, the other was going to follow.
How important was the move to Woodstock?
I think tremendously important. Now, they go up to Woodstock prior to his defection. Woodstock is an artist colony. So when he defects, a lot of the people in his social circles begin to shun him. And Frank, he still has some people up there. I mean, one of his best friend was Eugene O'Neal Jr. So the player, Eugene O'Neal, you know, the only American playwright that has a Nobel Prize, 4-time Pulitzer Prize winner. Frank was sort of, met Eugene O'Neal when he was writing Strange Interlude in Belgrade Lakes in Maine. O'Neal lent him a copy of Tristram Shandy. They talked about whether, there was going to be a war with Japan. This is in 1926. They played a game with Eugene O'Neal, what was like a Marco Polo style game in the water, where everyone was a country. And I don't know how you won the game, but so he was involved with the House of O'Neal and best friends with Eugene O'Neal. And Eugene O'Neal Jr., he moves up to Woodstock. And there happens, probably the pivotal moment of Frank's life, where this friend of his for almost a quarter of a century. I mean, if you've watched The Iceman Cometh or Long Day's Journey into Night or any of Eugene O'Neal's plays, they're very grim. They're very bleak. The grimmest creation of Eugene O'Neal was Eugene O'Neal Jr., Frank Meyer's best friend. And in September of 1950, he had asked a woman to marry him. She had said yes, and then she had second thoughts. And this set off a chain of events over 5 days in which you had the Meyers looking for this guy's body. He came in for a late night drinking session like he often did. And they said, well, we were really silly to think you had killed yourself. And he said, no, I was going to kill myself last night. I just didn't have the nerve. And they drink until 11. He leaves, he comes back. Then they drink until, 3:30 in the morning or something like that. He leaves. And the next day, Elsie goes to check on him and she finds his body at the foot of his stairs. And there was blood on the telephone. He had killed himself sort of Seneca style, both wrists and ankles. Not in the style of the characters of his father's plays, but instead he was a classicist. He taught the classics at Princeton and Yale and various other schools, and he killed himself in that kind of Roman way. But there was blood on the telephone, which makes you think, well, maybe he had second thoughts. He wasn't a very organized guy. He had forgot to pay. He didn't pay his telephone bill, so even if he wanted to call and get help, he couldn't. And that for Frank and Elsie, that was a real heavy moment. Things wouldn't be the same for them ever again.
The difference between Eugene O'Neal Sr. and Eugene O'Neal Jr., who was the playwright and what did Jr. do for a living?
Senior was the playwright, and Senior had 3 kids. 2 of them he basically stopped talking to, and he had a wife, a third wife, Carlotta Monterey, who basically excluded everyone from his life, including eventually Eugene Jr. Eugene Jr. Was he knew Greek, so he translated Greek. He wrote scholarly articles. He's writing articles he wrote an article for the New Yorker in the year of his death. He had jobs teaching the classics at various universities. He was sort of a permanent adjunct, and he made a name in his own right, separate from his father, in a field different from his father. He tried to get a little bit into theater and acting and being a narrator. He had a voice that sounded like Orson Welles, which is kind of a blessing, right? Orson Welles is a very booming kind of good voice. And ultimately, he showed up at there was Adolf Manju, who's sort of the inspiration for one of those Monopoly characters. He was so well dressed that I think they modeled one of the Monopoly characters after him. He showed up at a book event on television, drunk, intentionally dressed like a bum, to kind of contrast himself with the well-dressed Adolf Manju, who was always number one on the best dressed list. And he wrote an autobiography called "It Takes Nine Tailors" or something like that. So he thought it would be funny to show up, looking like a mess. And the problem the producers had is, imagine someone showing up in your television show drunk, that ends for him. So a lot of things in his personal life, because of alcohol, trying to fill this void. He had this relationship with his father where he didn't know Eugene O'Neal was his father until he was 11. So when he's 11, he changes his name to his father's name. And after that, it's not as though the relationship gets very close. Eugene O'Neal was sort of distant from his kids. And I think the women problems, the alcohol problems, the problems with his father all led to that moment in Woodstock where he kills himself in 1950. And his father lasts a few more years. But even at that point, his father had ceased writing plays. Parkinson's and other things, I believe it was Parkinson's, had taken over. If you look at some of the letters from him in 1950, 51, they look as though they were written inside of a blender. So Eugene O'Neal's health problems had been terrible at that point, but his son's mental health problems were also pretty terrible.
What's behind this statement that you wrote in your book? Harold R. Peet expunged Meyer's recent Stalinism, just as the agency omitted O'Neal's sustained inebriation.
They were a double act of sorts that would go around the country debating issues. By 1950, Frank was a conservative. You can see it in his writings that the language is unmistakable. He's a right winger at that point. And Eugene O'Neal Jr. is, still somewhat liberal, but they're best friends. And they go around having these debates and they're kind of like yelling at each other, but they're still best friends. That agency, which was a huge agency, speaking agency at the time, they sent them around. Now, they were making not a whole lot of money, but they made some money speaking. And people liked the kind of double act. They both went into that public speaking not out of they went into it out of necessity, out of desperation. But they both were in a bad spot. O'Neal had burned a lot of bridges at Yale and also in the broadcasting industry by just showing up to things drunk and being inappropriate. Meyer had, if people knew him at all at that point, they knew him as a Stalinist who had testified against his former comrades in what was the longest, most expensive trial in U.S. history to that point, the Smith Act trial of 1948 and 1949. Meyer was dubbed in the press, sensationalized as a star witness, a mystery witness. It was one of only 5 witnesses who were actually earnestly served the party as members. They weren't. He wasn't one of these, I was a communist for the FBI kind of guys that was infiltrated the party. He earnestly served the party. And so his testimony carried more weight. And so if they knew him at all, they knew him as a Stalinist. And the idea that, in 1950, you're a Stalinist, that's not the most fashionable thing to be in the United States, or even a former Stalinist.
Describe the physical nature of Frank Meyer and Elsie. What do they look like?
Frank's headmaster said he had unmistakable Hebrew features. So what that means, I don't know. He sort of had raccoonish eyes. He was, I think, 5'7", 5'8". He almost always through his adult life had sort of a grayish salt and pepper, kind of almost a crew cut, not quite a crew cut, enough to comb over. He is, it's funny, Bill Rusher, who was the publisher of National Review, for years he had been reading Frank Meyer and he'd never met him. And he called Frank Meyer the master. And he envisioned him as some sort of Viking-like figure. His writing, he thought this is going to be this big chiseled man who looks like a Viking. And when he saw him, he said, well, he looks more like a gnome. So Frank left an impression through his writing of some type of physicality that wasn't matched by who he was. And Elsie, Elsie, I think, what's interesting about Elsie, more descriptive about Elsie, is her behavior. A lot of her teachers thought of her as extremely shy. That someone who almost like off the charts shy. So Frank was kind of the outspoken one. Frank was the sort of life of the party one, and Elsie was the sort of the more silent member of the partnership.
Woodstock and his two sons, and I gather you know them both?
I do. I've met Gene Meyer and I've only met John Meyer telephonically. They're profoundly interesting people. His son Gene was one of the founders of the Federalist Society, was a longtime president of the Federalist Society, and his son John worked in the government bureaucracy for many years. What they both share in common is they are profoundly good chess players, like chess champions, or like really high-level chess people. What's interesting about Frank and Elsie is they become such, right wingers. They say, we don't trust the schools to educate our kids. We're going to homeschool. And in 1950, late 1940s, that's unusual. People aren't homeschooling their kids. And Frank and Elsie do that. There's a famous moment where someone from the state of New York comes to their house in Woodstock and say, your son's not showing up at school. And they said, well, yes, we're educating our sons at home. And the guy says, well, you can't do that. You don't have my permission to do that. You don't have the state's permission. They said, we don't need your permission to do anything with our kids. You need our permission to do something with our children. And Frank, I think even more so on the issue of communism, the issue of education was something that he was completely passionate about. And it turned out well for these two guys because they both graduated from Yale. They did very well there. And their chess prowess was just off the charts.
So, kind of review, Frank Meyer was born in 1909 and died in 1972 when he was 62 years old.
Correct.
At what point did they buy Woodstock, and at what point did he start to have these confabs where people would make a pilgrimage to Woodstock? And who went?
He bought the Woodstock place in December of 1944. They're social creatures, so initially they have a lot of people from Woodstock there. I mean, Philip Guston, who a few years ago sold a painting for $26 million. I mean, he's dead, but one of his paintings went for $26 million. He used to come over until Eisenhower was elected, and Frank wasn't a big Eisenhower supporter, but he blamed Frank for Eisenhower's election, and he thought that Eisenhower being elected was going to bring incipient fascism to the United States. And so he started shunning Frank Meyer. And a lot of the people in that community started shunning Frank. So Frank started importing his community. His life changed. He became a nocturnal creature after he testified against the communists. He buys a gun. I think not without reason. The Communist Party had killed, obviously, a lot of people, killed a lot of Americans, but they had killed a few Americans. And so Frank, whether he's paranoid or whether you think, well, that's a cautious thing, he buys a gun. He starts staying up all night, and they start importing company. Gary Mills, who, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, he had said that in the late 1950s and early 1960s, he spent more time with Frank and Elsie Meyer than anyone outside of his own family. Joan Didion comes up. Frank is the first person to publish a freelance article by Joan Didion. And her boyfriend, Noel Parmentel, had been taking her all over New York, saying, listen, she works at this fashion magazine or women's magazine. She's a great writer. And all of the editors, for whatever reason, balked at publishing this woman. Frank saw the profound talent that she had. So she was a visitor to Woodstock. Arlene Krejci, who was later a dance critic for The New Yorker, she came up to Woodstock. Richard Allen, who was National Security Advisor, I believe, in the Reagan administration, he made the journey. David Brodnoy, who was a huge presence on Boston radio, WBZ, one of those 50,000 watt old kind of channels that used to reach into 38 states on a good night, he would come up. He said that, I've never spent a more relaxing or a taxing weekend of my life than that weekend in Woodstock. And what he meant by that is that they would be sitting there debating, drinking, smoking, eating all night long. Frank might go into a stemliner speech about why he thinks Barry Goldwater should be president, or he might start quoting passages from Shakespeare. And you were surrounded by, people said the house was insulated by the best minds in Western civilization because all of the walls were just books kind of like behind you. And so people went up there. A lot of them were younger. And many of these people, if you look at the next generation of the conservative movement, I mean, Frank was a founder of the American Conservative Union, the Philadelphia Society. He was at the founding meeting of Young Americans for Freedom. profoundly influenced the Sharon Statement that came out of that. He was present at the creation of National Review, and he was at the founding meeting of the Conservative Party of New York. So he helped to create the skeletal structure of the conservative movement. But what he also did was he groomed his successors. They had people coming up there that within a few years, all of the major conservative groups, these were people that had made that pilgrimage to Woodstock. In the 1960s, going to Woodstock meant one thing for the rest of the youth culture, but for conservatives, going to Woodstock meant something very different. It didn't mean going to a concert. It meant making that obligatory pilgrimage up Ohio Mountain to stay with the Meyers and to basically talk history and politics and literature and all sorts of things all weekend. What's interesting about that spot is that Frank, he moves up there to kind of get away from everything. And who moves next door to him during the late 1960s? But the very embodiment of the decade, Bob Dylan. And in a way, I can't think of two more different people than Bob Dylan and Frank Meyer, but they met and they talked. And Frank said, man has reasonably good sense. And if you read Dylan's autobiography, he went up there to escape the hippies and all these people that thought he was a guru knocking on his door, wanting to get some droplet of wisdom from him. He goes, and so where does he move? He moves next to Frank Meyer because that's where people are going to find him. And in his autobiography, Dylan said, I wanted to set fire to these people, meaning the hippies. Now, Frank never said anything as harsh about the hippies as Bob Dylan did, but in a weird sense, they both had a similar view of the 1960s. And Frank didn't think it was all that great. He had been more of a libertarian at the beginning of the decade, but as events, assassinations, crime, all sorts of chaos starts to explode, he starts to emphasize more the order part of his philosophy.
You know, when you go through the list of everything that he was involved in, including his son with the Federalist Society, one of the co-founders of the Federalist Society, and the CPAC, Conservative Political Action Conference and Committee, which meets here most of the time, the American Conservative Union, and you go down this list, I want to ask you, and it's out of context with Frank Meyer, but one of the people who was involved with all those organizations right now was the fellow that was just assassinated, Charlie Kirk.
Sure.
And I'm not sure what the question is, but I just want your reflection on when that happened, because of all the time you've spent studying the conservative movement.
Yeah, I think that, like we said earlier, Meyer kept a gun because he thought some radical people were going to take him out because he had testified against the Communist Party. That's a very different thing. Communist Party was organized. It was a whole bunch of people. It seems like this guy that shot Kirk, at least from what we know now, was kind of a lone wolf, that the type of person that internet culture kind of creates. Kirk was kind of a creation of internet culture, and his assassin kind of came out of that too in his own way as well. So obviously that's very different. But the skull, Frank creating the skull structure, Charlie Kirk and all of these people that had such a profound effect over the last 10 years or so, they're standing on the shoulders of giants. There were people that came before them. It may seem like they created the world anew in 2016 with MAGA and all that kind of thing, but there was an apparatus. There was at least an organized conservative movement at that point. When Meyer, after World War II, Meyer, Bill Buckley, all of these people that's founded the conservative movement, so thoroughly had the conservatives been, uprooted after, during Roosevelt's presidency, during the New Deal, that Russell Kirk was going to title his landmark book, The Conservative Mind, The Conservative Right, because these people, Isabel Patterson and John T. Flynn and Frank Chodoroff and all these guys that were conservatives prior to the war, they were just obliterated. They had no influence in society, and so they opted to create conservatism anew. And Meyer, Bill Buckley, Russell Kirk, all these guys contributed to that. There was nothing. There was something there for Charlie Kirk and some of the people of this generation. I don't know that people appreciate it as much because there has been sort of a change in the direction of conservatism unmistakably since Trump became president. But there was an apparatus there. There was no apparatus there when Meyer and Buckley and all these people started.
What impact, if any, did the release of Sam Tannenhaus's book on Buckley have on your book as you go about? Because they're both kind of tied together in some ways.
Yes, someone asked me that the other day, and it's just chance. I mean, my book, I was wanting the book to come out in 2023. I mean, I've been working on this for many, many years, and I mean, it's a good thing it didn't come out in 2023, but I was really pushing for it to come out. And it just by chance came out, I don't know, 3 months after Sam's book came out. I haven't read Sam's book, so I can't really comment on it. I will just say about Frank's, Buckley is certainly a much more famous figure. I would say that Meyer, I think, led a much more interesting life, a much more varied life, where he's having affairs with multiple women that have Wikipedia entries. This is prior to his marriage. That he is, neck deep in the Communist Party. There's secret agents trailing him and taking notes on his life and all this kind of thing. That's a life that Buckley didn't have. Buckley, unlike most of the early conservatives in the post-war conservative movement, Buckley was a cradle to grave conservative. And most of these other guys, Jim Burnham, Wilmore Kendall, Brent Bazell, even Russell Kirk, they all spent some time on the left, and a lot of them spent time as communists, Trotskyists in the case of Jim Burnham. Meyer was a little bit different because he, like Whittaker Chambers, he was heavily involved in the party. He was a hardcore Stalinist, certainly a leader in Great Britain, and eventually elevates from a sort of a mid-level manager in America, and he becomes, very tight with Earl Browder, the head of the whole enterprise. So I think that Meyer's life is a more interesting life. He gives me more ammunition. But Buckley, I think the advantage that Tannenhouse has is that, Buckley's, even to this day, a very famous figure.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. So what year, if he lived to be to be 62 in 1972, what year would he have been called legitimately a conservative? What would be the first year?
1950, I would say, is where I could trail that I could see in his writings, this guy's a right-winger. In 1952, Meyer is urging the Freeman, which is a conservative publication, not to endorse Eisenhower. They were mad because Taft didn't get the nomination. Robert Taft, Mr. Conservative, Mr. Republican. He didn't get the nomination. Eisenhower did. And they said, let's withhold our support. Let's not endorse him. Henry Hazlitt, who's another person on the political right, he engineers their downfall, basically gets them kicked out of the Freeman. Meyer, William Chamberlain, Suzanne Follett comes from a left-wing family, famous political family. They all sort of get kicked out. So Meyer goes from being a Truman voter in 1948 to 1952. He's so pure that he's having misgivings about even voting for Eisenhower. Now he does, but that's how quickly his shift in political allegiances went.
Tannenhouse, and I can't remember because I've read both his book and your book, but Tannenhouse made a big thing out of the fact that Brent Bozell, and you need to tell us who he was. Brent Bozell wrote Conscience of a Conservative, which was the book that helped Goldwater become the nominee in 1964. First of all, do you find that to be true, that he did write it? And where was Frank Meyer in all this?
It was true. He definitely wrote that book. What's interesting is that Conscience of a Conservative is really sort of like a Meyerite, National Review, Bill Buckley style conservative book. Brent Bozell, and one of the things that I found was about 1,000 letters from Brent Bozell, and they're profoundly interesting. He goes to Spain with his family in 1960, and it changes him forever. Prior to that, he had been more of a libertarian-leaning conservative. After that, you'd say he's a theocon or Catholic conservative, very religiously imbued conservative. And he writes Frank and says, listen, the United States is no longer fit to save Western civilization. Spain is the only country that can do this. You need to come over here and live here like we are, and live here like Wilmore Kendall, the other editor from National Review, because this is the only country. And he says, I no longer want to be president of the United States. I want to be Cadillo of Spain. And Moon gets this letter and says, what do you suppose I'm supposed to do about earning money going to Spain? I'm supposed to support my family. Even if I believed what you're saying about Spain saving the West, we're going to run National Review from Spain. We're going to have an auxiliary in Kent, Connecticut, where Jim Burnham's our American correspondent. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So he doesn't go, but it shows you, we talked about Meyer's rapid transformation. It shows you Bozell's rapid transformation, that in 1960, he ghostwrites this book for Goldwater, which again is a very sort of libertarian-leaning conservative book. And then the next year, by 1962, he's battling Meyer about the meaning of conservatism, mocking libertarianism, mocking sort of free market stuff. And he is embracing this religiously infused conservatism because Spain had that much of an influence on him.
Talk about the trust that you have in an individual, any individual who is Jewish, becomes an atheist, and then at the end tries to become a Catholic, starts out as a communist, then becomes conservative, a fusionist, or however you want to. I mean, how do you trust what that person was writing at the end of his life or how he was living?
Yes. Well, I think that people have dealt with that issue. I mean, Theodore Sturgeon, who's one of these writers that Meyer had, Theodore Sturgeon was a Star Trek writer, and Meyer had him reviewing science fiction for National Review. He came up with the line "Live long and prosper" in Star Trek. Came up with the Prime Directive. He said to Robert Heinlein, another science fiction writer, that Meyer was one of these guys that needed to have sort of instructions nailed to his hotel room wall, and that even though he had been a communist and now he was conservative, he's just as sure that he's right now as he was before. But obviously, you can't both be right. So there were people that viewed people that had changed cynically. And I think for Meyer, there's some people that reach for a beer, and then there's some people that reach for like the 110 proof bottle. And Meyer wanted stronger stuff. Even with religion, you bring up, he did convert to Catholicism the last 6 hours of his life. He was a Catholic. And when Mike Wallace, who was Jewish, asked Meyer, why did you leave Judaism? Because at that point, he's just sort of a Christian of no denomination. And Meyer said, well, I was a Reformed Jew. If I had been raised Orthodox, maybe conservative Jew, I must still be involved in Judaism. But I wasn't. Reform Judaism wasn't asking much, and so I wasn't giving it much. It's the same thing when he was at Oxford. He was faced with a choice, and it sounds like a weird choice, but he thought, I either become a Catholic or I become a communist. Now, those seem to be on the opposite ends of the spectrum, but what Catholicism and communism have in common is they demand a lot from the people involved in those faiths. And I think Meyer was someone that wanted to believe something strongly. He wanted to give, and he made the choice of communism at Oxford, and then he sort of tabled the choice of Catholicism. And on his deathbed, he decided to convert 6 hours before his death in 1972.
When did he go to work for National Review, and how long was he there, and how did he get along with everybody there?
He went to work for National Review from the start. He was present at the creation. A guy named Philly Schlamm had been the books editor. Schlamm had a fight with Buckley and Jim Burnham. He gets defenestrated. Meyer takes over his role as the literary editor of National Review, but he also takes over his role as kind of the anti-James Burnham, as the leader of the right wing within National Review. Schlamm had been the anti-James Burnham. Meyer takes his spot there. And he stays at the magazine until his death in 1972. So 17 years, he's at National Review. I think the reason he lasts is because he's up at Woodstock. He's sort of an early version of a telecommuter. If he were in the office, I'm sure they would be having arguments and things like that. But he wasn't. And the big fight over those 17 years was between Frank Meyer and Jim Burnham about what direction the conservative movement should take, about what kind of a magazine National Review should be. Meyer wanted to be more of like an appeal to reason or ISKRO, issuing marching orders to the conservative movement. Jim Burnham wanted to be like any other magazine that would fit in on the newsstand, magazine of news and opinion, but one that leaned to the right. So they had a very different conception of the magazine. They had a very different conception of what conservatism was. And they fought. Meyer was very excitable. Jim Burnham was cool and lawyerly. Early on with Meyer, he had a big intellectual fight with Russell Kirk. Russell Kirk couldn't let it go. I don't think Meyer thought a day of his life about what Russell Kirk was thinking or anything like that. Russell Kirk couldn't let it go that Meyer had criticized him. And even when Buckley said to Kirk, we need you to join the masthead of National Review, Kirk said, how can I stand cheek by jowl with those two, meaning Frank Meyer and Frank Choroff, because they had sort of conspired on a hit piece on Kirk. So Meyer didn't think about Kirk that same relationship was between Meyer and Burnham, except Meyer was the one obsessing over Burnham. I don't think Burnham went home and thought a second for Frank Meyer, but he liked to amuse himself by just hooking him up, getting him going, threatening to kill his book section, or just doing things that would be an annoyance to Meyer, and Meyer would get excited. So they had this long fight. Meyer loses the battle for National Review. He wins the battle for the broader conservative movement, and the movement starts to take on to reflect what Meyer believes and not what Burnham believes. And National Review starts to look more like a magazine that Jim Burnham wanted.
Both in Sam Tannenhaus's book and your book, one name that seems to, I don't know what the word is, tick off conservatives is Gary Wills, who is 91 years old, still alive. But what is it about Gary Wills that made everybody in the conservative movement around National Review mad?
Well, he made me mad because he wouldn't sit for an interview for me. Everyone else would be interviewed, but he had a bunch of excuses why he couldn't talk to me. He talked to Sam, he talked to other people, but Gary went in the opposite direction as Meyer. Gary was Meyer's protege at National Review. When they had a youth issue, he wrote the Principles and Heresies column that Meyer had normally written because everyone associated Gary Wills with Meyer. I think if Meyer and other people at National Review were being honest with themselves, they would realize that Gary Wills was never a right winger in the same way that they were. That he was Catholic, but he was not, grounded philosophically the way these other people were. And so, as the '60s moved on, Frank became more about order and less about liberty. He's always more a liberty guy. Wills went in a different direction. He became quite liberal, and this was heartbreaking to Meyer, so much so that I have a letter from Bill Rusher, the publisher of National Review, to Gary Wills saying, listen, I kept the promise. I haven't shared any of your recent articles with Frank because he knew sending these articles up to Frank that Frank would have a big fit. This was his protege. And rather than follow him in his direction, he went the exact opposite journey ideologically from right to left. And that caused Meyer a bunch of dismay. And I think people, thing with National Review was that there were people who were ideologically pure, and then there were people that were very talented. Gary Wills was a very talented writer. Joan Didion was a very talented writer, and they were somewhat conservative in those days. But Bill Buckley, the editor, he had enough tolerance and good sense to realize I'm running a magazine. I'm not running a political party. And what you need in a magazine is people that have talent. It helps if they sort of agree with the general line, but he was not even opposed to hiring people that were liberals or left wing, as long as they could do a good job. And a lot of the people it's strange for Meyer because in his Principles and Heresies column in National Review, he's looking like the chief ideologist of the post-war right. In his Books, Arts, and Manners section, where he was the editor of the literary section, it was much freer. And he realized, well, I have to have people review books, not that are correct politically, but that can write well and that can understand these books. And so he had all sorts of people, really a golden age, one of the best book review sections of any magazine in the 20th century, having these people like Gary Wills and Guy Davenport, Hugh Kenner and Theodore Sturgeon and Joan Didion, all these big names, Arlene Croce, reviewing books for him. There was no litmus test there, and you would kind of expect that from a guy like Meyer. You would kind of expect him to put down an ideological litmus test. He was smart enough not to do that in that literary section.
So, reading your book and Sam Tannenhaus's book, that everybody's going from one side to the other, and you really keep asking yourself, what do they really believe? So I want to ask you first, what do you really believe, and how long have you believed it, and have you changed your mind?
I guess I like this is a harsher term. I like the phrase right winger because what does a conservative believe? I don't know what a conservative believes. I think for Meyer, what a conservative believed, what fusionism was about, was that if you're a conservative in Great Britain, you conserve the monarchy or the aristocracy. If you're a conservative in the United States, what's significant about us? Well, the tradition here is the founding. And what does the founding mean? The founding means freedom. And so the tradition that you conserve in the United States is the tradition of freedom. That's why Meyer had this, this melding, this fusionism of traditionalists and libertarians. I think that worked for him because it was simple. At its most sort of distilled form, it's true. And because it also had political utility. It brought together people that you would think are disparate camps. It brought them together. There's a lot of things that conservatives do that I don't agree with. There's, stances they take that I don't take. I like not to have labels. I don't think I came into this as I've never called myself a fusionist, which was what the label that was on Frank. But I think fusionism is basically a good idea. It's a sound idea in its most sort of simplistic form when you look at America. So I think Tannenhouse is a little different. I read his book on Chambers. I think most people thought it was a beautiful book. It was a tremendous book. I haven't read his book on Buckley, but from what I'm told, a lot of it is Tannenhouse, or some of it, Tannenhouse seeps in there where he's sort of peacocking about, I believe this and I'm a liberal. And I don't really believe doing that in a biography, because people want to learn about Frank Meyer or Bill Buckley. You don't have to insert yourself and say, I condemn him for having this view in the civil rights movement or whatever. And a lot of that, from what I hear, that's kind of the harmful thing in his book. But it's unfair to me. I haven't read his book, and I did read the Chambers book, and boy, was that a terrific book. So I didn't know that Sam Tannenhouse could really screw up a biography. He's quite talented.
How did Frank Meyer die?
These guys were living a madman existence, and Frank was chain smoking all the time. Other than the telephone, which he was, his telephone bills at certain points in the 1960s were a quarter of his income. He was on the telephone that much. So he's up in this mountain. You think he's a hermit up there. No, he's using the telephone, calling everyone. But the other symbol of Frank was the cigarette, the lit cigarette. And a lot of these guys back then, there was a lot of drinking, there was a lot of smoking. Some of them had womanizing. I mean, there's a letter I have from Wilmer Kendall and Frank Meyer. He said, listen, I'm on kind of a health kick. I've gone down from my normal intake of 70 cigarettes a day. Now I'm smoking 20 cigarettes a day. I don't know that Frank was smoking 3.5 cigarettes a day, but he was smoking a lot. In late 1971, he started feeling pain in his chest. And at a certain point, they're praying for it to be tuberculosis. Imagine praying that you had tuberculosis, but such was the situation back then. And lung cancer back then, it was similar to like brain cancer now, that if you get it, you have a very slim chance of surviving. And the diagnosis was Frank to sort of live weeks or months. He lasted days. And they got Gene Clark, who was an assistant to Cardinal Spellman, to go up there. Frank had a lot of friends, including Gary Wills and Bazell and Buckley, who were Catholics. Wilmer Kendall, his friend, had become a Catholic. He had been dead at that point. So there was some pressure on him to become a Catholic. But what we talked about earlier, suicide. His best friend in the world had committed suicide, Eugene O'Neal Jr., and he didn't want to join a church that condemned this guy to eternal damnation. So he had philosophical disputes with the church. And there was a delay. And finally, he just said, okay, I'm joining the church. He had some misgivings, but he thought this is the most philosophical of all of the religions. So he joined the Catholic Church. And I don't know that he ever stepped foot, at least to worship in a Catholic church in his life. But for the last 6 hours of Frank Meyer's life, he was a Catholic.
What happened to his wife, Elsie? How long did she live?
Elsie lived for 3 more years, and that situation's a little bit more tragic. I talked to the same fellow that I got the papers from in the warehouse. He knew the Meyers, and he went to visit her after Frank's death with another guy. They would go up to the Catskills to do fly fishing and stay overnight at the Meyer house. And she said, well, could you teach me how to, they were guys that knew how to use firearms. Could you teach me how to use a firearm? And they taught her how to use the gun. And they're thinking, well, this is because she's a widow out in the middle of nowhere. And if something goes down, the cops aren't going to be here for a while. So this is right. We're teaching her to use a gun. During the course of the conversation, she starts talking about the loss of Frank. She felt that her position at National Review, she had was demeaning, that they were paying her more money, they were paying Frank, but she was essentially a copy editor, which I got to tell you, as a writer, a copy editor is tremendously important, but she thought that was a demeaning position, that she was just a copy editor. And she starts to get in a very dark mood. And these guys realize, we didn't teach her to use the gun to defend herself. She's going to use this gun on herself. And they become panicked, and people try to intervene. In April of 1975, about 3 years after Frank died, Elsie took her own life just a few hundred yards from where she found Eugene O'Neal's body when he had taken her own life. The 3 of them believed in suicide. In fact, the homeowner after Frank, they found cyanide. So there's a question about whether Frank was thinking, when he was, and cancer was overcoming his body, he was going to die anyway. But if the pain was so great, I think he thought of suicide as a live option with obtaining that cyanide. They all believed in kind of self-willfulness, individualism, and the individual's right to take his own life. That was part of what their beliefs were. And Elsie exercised that belief, unfortunately. And so her last years were pretty tragic.
In the front of your book, it says the publication of this book was made possible by the generosity of the Henry Regnery Legacy Fund. What is that?
I don't know. It's money that, so I signed books. When I first signed the contract to this book, it was through I signed books. And over the course of years, who was my publisher? It was getting changed because people in the book industry, companies bought other companies. And so the book, I was reading the book long enough that there were multiple different publishers that were running it. ISI, which is a great organization in Wilmington, Delaware, that's more of an intellectual bent. It's conservative, but it's more of an intellectual bent. They were able to obtain grants to publish books, and the Regnery Legacy Fund, I believe, is money because Henry Regnery, of course, was a publisher, and I believe that money is intended to allow conservative books to be published.
What's next for Dan Flynn?
Oh, I don't know. There's so many of these characters that I found fascinating, and I probably have 100,000 letters in my house that I got from this warehouse. And I couldn't have crammed even, 1% of it in this book. And so there's so many stories to be told. I love that story of the early National Review where you have these three musketeers, Frank Meyer, Wilmore Kendall, and Brent Bazell. They are profoundly intelligent men, but they're all troubled men to some degree. They're all kind of dysfunctional to some degree. Kendall, I think now you'd say this guy has a personality disorder. A guy like Bazell, it's no secret. Ultimately, he, got some kind of a mental illness and started doing all sorts of wild things, including stealing a van in Northern Ireland and, crashing through a gate with it. And then Meyer too was his own sort of interesting cat. These were very interesting men, even aside from the fact that they were profoundly influential on the American right. I would love to explore them more deeply in the fight that they had, at least some of them had, with Jim Burnham. Jim Burnham was a very different man. And these three musketeers, they clashed with Burnham, and that's something that I'm excited about. And maybe I don't know if that's a book or an article or what that is, but that's interesting to me.
The name of Daniel J. Flynn's book that we've been talking about is "The Man Who Invented Conservatism: The Unlikely Life of Frank S. Meyer." Thank you, sir, for your time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.